Probably the best way to answer that is to understand that trauma is not one thing. We have acute trauma, which is your events, and people can get traumatized that way. And again, it's not event, because we have a lot of people that experience the same event and aren't traumatized by it. So it's not the nature of the event, which what everybody wants to think it's the bad event. It's that your body is overwhelmed by the response. So that can happen in a single event, which we call an acute event. It can happen in a chronic situation where you're having repetitive stressors over and over again. And then you have the complex. And so you approach each of those very differently, in the delivery of treatment. And the easiest one to work with is actually the single event piece. If they've had a fairly optimal life beforehand and they have this single event and they already know what it looks like to not to have that, and they can go back through some supportive help and maybe some therapy, be able to get to the other side and kind of be restored to what they were before. And about 80% of the people that have acute trauma never go into any kind of services because they have enough support in their system, whatever their family or their work or whatever environment that they're in. They have enough support to get through it without having to do that. So you're only seeing about 20% of the people that have acute events in a trauma setting. What is it that you're actually dealing with is the first thing to identify. Once you know that, then you know, okay, what do I need to do to move people through this? And again, the same things we talked about earlier. The people need safety, they need clarity, they need certainty, they need predictability, and they need it to be relevant to them. And in order to be able to provide all of those things requires the therapist to be able to attune to the client. In other words, we all have attuned relationships, but it requires the therapist to be really good at attuning to their client. And you use that attunement as kind of the ground floor of whatever interventions you use. So part of it is understanding what you're dealing with and what it takes from the point of view of understanding this person and being attuned to them. If you cannot attune to them, you cannot do trauma work well. When you look at the data of who comes in for psychiatric mental health services, and I don't have the data for Pakistan, but I do have the data for the United States. And what we know is in the United States, 92% of people that come in for any mental health service or psychiatric service have at least 4 traumas in their history. So whether you want to be a trauma therapist or not, you are. Because that's the primary problem that people struggle with, is the dysregulation caused by stress responses. And we have built this $1 billion a year drug business, and we're not seeing long-term results with that because we're medicating, which is fine, but we're not then following it up with teaching people how to manage their bodies themselves. Quit making people crazy for having biological responses that are appropriate. And I have this argument with schools and teachers all the time. Look, you have this kid that spent the whole weekend being, traumatized by the stress in their family. A lot of rejection, a lot of controlling, a lot of, performance anxiety. And they go to school on a Monday morning, and you want them to sit down and be able to focus on math, and their whole body is in a state of arousal. What are you doing to help them calm down before you want to jump them into things? And they always say, well, that's not our job. if you're going to teach children in this day and age, it is your job. You know, if you can't help them regulate themselves, I think trauma has been, the word trauma I really would like to see be substituted for just compassionate treatment. Because that's really what we're talking about, treating other people compassionately. Understand when you have a kid melting down that it isn't because of bad behavior. It is because of something going on inside of them. And until we address that, then what we're doing is by blaming the child or saying there's something wrong with the child for behaving this way, what we're doing is getting another little piece of their self-worth and throwing it out. I think that understanding human behavior from the point of view of what goes on when the body's changing is really important, because what ends up happening is we see an outcome that's driven by a total biological process, and we don't like this outcome, and so we punish, label, discipline people for this, and we don't understand where it comes from or why it's existing. And a lot of times that there's a lot of resistance to doing that, because you have to take a step back from the individual and say what's going on in their environment is triggering these responses. And that means that the people, particularly for a child, the people in charge of the environment are not creating a safe, predictable, clear certainty, not making it relevant. So that for me is doing some basic understanding of what's really going on with the body. A silly example: children that experience trauma early, a lot of times what happens in their most stressful moments, they don't look any different, but they'll start complaining that they can't see. And particularly kids that wear glasses, we'll notice if stress goes on very long, the prescription changes, because the musculature around the orbital cavity, when it's constricted all the time, the eye loses some of its flexibility, which affects the range of vision. And so a lot of times you'll see this, particularly in kids that enter foster care. They'll need new glasses. They're in this new stressful environment. They may be safer, but this is not a familiar environment, so they're stressed. And then after they get comfortable, this new prescription's kind of wrong for them. And so it's not unusual to, if you understand what's going on, see the children go through frequent glasses changes. So part of the challenge is that your people are smart enough to rebel against the established message of mental health, that people are mentally ill. They want to give them these negative labels, and they want to put them on these kind of drugs until they have to go through these kinds of programs. But that's really, it's more about understanding what's going on in the body and how to help people manage that. Because when people are able to regulate themselves in stressful situations on an ongoing basis, they don't need therapy. But nobody in the therapy world wants to tell you that. They'll give you, therapy after therapy after therapy, drug after drug after drug. It's kind of like earlier when I don't remember, it was this, when I talked about Joseph Wolpe before. Here in 1958, he publishes this wonderful body of work that says if your body is relaxed, you can't be angry, you can't be anxious, you can't have fear. And why wasn't that incorporated into the mental health field? It wasn't, because it was counter to the profit motive of pharmacy companies, and it also moved the problem from being in here or in here out into the environment. And when you do that, you realize that, it's a whole different game. How do you help somebody regulate their environment? So one of the motivators for coming to Pakistan and kind of introducing the concepts that I have with you guys for the last year, a little over a year now, is that you'll provide better care. You will be able to accomplish things with clients that have been in multiple therapies and not fail at, and we don't stigmatize.